Hello, I'm Heather Hoffman with Pinkfresh Studio, and I'm here today for Stamp and Scrapbook Expo's Shop at Home Christmas in July event. We do have a special promotion running for this event. You're going to find 20% off of all of the stamps and dies in our Christmas category using promo code Christmas20. That's going to stay valid through August 8th, so you have a little time to kind of get prepped for Christmas card making as we get closer and closer to that time of year so quickly. I have a couple simple cards I'm going to create with you today as well, with some simple stamping, ink blending, and watercolor techniques. One card is going to be a little bit more of a modern bright pop of color with some gold accents. And then our second card is more of a traditional Christmas palette, but a little bit of a vintage twist on that one. So I hope you'll follow along and join me as we create those, and Merry Christmas in July.
Okay, for our first card here, we're going to do these bright watercolor simple stripes with a little bit of die cutting with some gold glitter cardstock, and you might have noticed some gold splatters on that background a little bit. I'm starting off with some white watercolor cardstock. This is from Tonic Studios. I just like how nice and bright and white, but it's also got a great watercolor texture. Before I start doing the watercolor stripes, I'm going to start off by using the largest die from Essentials Stitched Rectangles. I'm going to just die cut that out. It'll give a nice finished edge to that watercolor panel, and it'll look great on our finished card as well. All right, I have 3 colors of liquid watercolor that we're going to use: bubblegum, key lime, and aquamarine. I'm going to give them a good shake before I put them into my palette. I just found this kind of mixes the colors and eliminates any sediment or separation that might have occurred, and it'll keep your colors really consistent as you keep on using them. These have a handy spill-proof cap and the little eyedroppers that make it easy to put a small amount into my palette. These are super highly pigmented, so you'll definitely notice a little bit goes a very long ways. As I start to mix them here, I just grab a little color, mix it with some water to kind of thin it down and get my color nice and soft. I'm going to start with that center stripe with that key lime watercolor. It's such a bright, vibrant, happy color. It's one of my very favorites. I really love it. You notice I'm making my stripes wider than the width of my brush. This is a 1.5 inch flat brush. So you could use a wider brush. I also kind of like the abstract lines you get from doing multiples of these. And I kind of just go back and forth until I'm happy with kind of how the line is mixed out. Because these are so highly pigmented and you thin them down with water, if at any point you want a little more color or a little more vibrant, it's really easy to add a little bit of additional color as well. My hand got a little shaky there at the end, but that's the beauty of watercolor. The more imperfect it is, the better it looks. At least that's kind of what my feeling on it is. So I'm just going to kind of layer on that color, mix it on there until I'm kind of happy with how that ends up. I'm making my stripes so that they don't overlap. I didn't want the colors to mix and blend in the middle. If you'd like them to do that, just overlap and they'll naturally run and mix together. Just make sure you like the colors that are next to each other and how they'll mix together. You can test it out on a little bit of scratch paper, or if you wanted them to overlap and not mix and blend, you could do one stripe and wait until it was fully dry before you moved on to the next one. And then even if they touch or overlap, the colors won't necessarily blend and bleed together. So that's kind of helpful to know as well. All right, just about finished there. I'm just going to make sure that strip is about the right width that I'd like there and that I've got enough color on there. And you can kind of see as I pick it up that the colors are still wet, so we're going to set this aside and let it dry nice and thoroughly while we work on some other parts of this card. And you can also kind of see the difference between the stripes on the first card that I made as a sample and the one we did here. The beauty of watercolor, no two are ever going to turn out exactly the same. All right, next we're going to move on to some of our die cutting with some gold glitter cardstock. This is just there's lots of different companies you can get this from. Any good gold glitter cardstock will work. I'm going to set my die on here the more detailed word for the joy and cheer that we're going to use from Classic Holiday Words, and also the leafy branch die. I found some simple Scotch tape works best to hold my dies in place on the glitter cardstock. And then the shadow layer of Classic Holiday Words I did on white cardstock, and just a little bit of purple tape to hold that in place and make sure my die didn't move as it went through my die cut machine. Again, I'm using my Gemini Junior. Your favorite die cut machine is just fine. I've just gotten spoiled by not having to hand crank. Once you go electric, you never want to go back. All right, now that those are all die cut, I'm just using a little poker tool to pull some of those little extra pieces out of those dies. I love just how intricate and detailed and pretty these are, especially when you cut them from gold paper. There's just something so pretty about that super detailed look in the gold glitter. So I'm going to pop each of those words out there and then make sure any random little detail places of the words as well that I poke those out using my poker tool. There's not very many on these words, thankfully, but I want to get all those little details out. All right, now the easiest way with how intricate these word dies are that I found to adhere them together is to use some form of a glue pen. I'm going to be using a Zig 2-way glue pen, and I'd like to use a little piece of printer paper just to protect my work surface because inevitably the glue ends up over the lines, of course, on those detail dies. So I just kind of put the glue on the back and then I can adhere it in place, and I know it's going to hold nice and firm, and it's just kind of an easy way to get those detail little bits adhered down there. My background, like I said, on that for that shadow layer, that's one fun thing with the classic holiday words. It gives you lots of options. You can use with or without the shadow layer if you just want the super small detail word dies, but I wanted that shadow layer, so a little later I can pop that up on my card with some foam adhesive, and that makes it a really easy way to do that. All right, now that we have that adhered together, I'm going to check, and it looks like for the most part, our watercolor stripes are fairly dry. So I'm going to pull out my well-worn little box I keep for adding splatters. And to add the gold splatters, I'm going to use my Gansey Tambi Starry Colors palette. I like to pick one of the gold, and I use a little spray bottle just to add a little bit of water and then a fine brush and just kind of stir it until you get a nice gold paint texture. The thinner you do them, the less opaque the splatters will be, and the thicker you get that mixture, the more opaque your gold splatters will be. So I use a thin paintbrush just to add those on. That's kind of my favorite technique for adding those gold splatters. And those are going to dry fairly quickly. So I'm just going to kind of set it there while I go ahead and add my foam adhesive to the back of my sentiments. I like to keep a larger roll of this foam adhesive, and then I just trim it down to the right size. And I noticed I had some gold splatters on my desk despite my box that I used to protect that surface. So I took a second there to quickly clean those up so I didn't end up with gold smudges on anything that I didn't want them to end up on. All right. I like to make sure I have enough foam adhesive that those are going to be nice and stable when I put them on my card and not to get caught on anything or pull up really easily. So I sometimes get accused of overusing my foam adhesive. So if you want to use less, don't feel like you have to put this much on. This is just kind of one of my little quirks that I kind of decided there to finally call it quits and just call that good. Before I peel those off and put them on, I'm going to pull off that leafy branch die that I die cut. I'm going to trim it kind of down in half, and I'm going to layer those on. I ended up with a couple extra leaves that I just kind of trimmed off to make that fit on that corner. And by doing this, I'm not wasting any of that dye, but I'm able to use both sides of it. And it only takes a tiny little dot of liquid glue just on those kind of larger areas there that you can see on the back of that. And those are the only contact points I'm going to glue down on these. It's going to hold it plenty firmly in place if it's a good high quality liquid glue, but it's also going to allow those leaves the freedom to kind of curl up a little and add a little dimension to our finished project. All right, I carefully put those on. I don't know if my gold splatters were quite dry by this point, but I went ahead and ran the risk of them not being quite dry and just was really careful as I put them down. You might want to wait a little longer and just wait till they're dry to the touch. And you can kind of tell when they don't look wet anymore that they're dry and ready to go down. All right, now I peeled off the backing to that foam tape on our word dies there, adhered that in place, and can you see all that fun sparkle? And then the final little piece to our card here is my card base, and I have a coordinating just bright green cardstock that I've trimmed down already, half of an 8.5 by 11 piece of cardstock, and I'm scoring it at the 4 1/4 just so that I can fold it in half to create a top folding landscape size card. And then I'm going to adhere that on my front there with foam adhesive. You could adhere it directly down, but The more dimension a card has, I just kind of think it's more fun. If you wanted this to be more flat and mailable, you might want to just adhere it straight on the card base. And the same even with those word dies on the front. If you wanted to be able to mass produce this, that would be a simple step that would make it a little bit easier to put this together and to pop through the mail as well. All right, pop that down in place, and this card, all bright and cheery, is all finished. Here's a little bit of a closer look. You can see how the gold accents all kind of pull this card together and add that fun little bit of shine, and how those bright colors just pop out and are so cheery. And it makes me think of, I think of them as modern colors, but it also makes me think of kind of vintage Christmas ornaments, some of those bright ones from the 50s. I know when I grew up, I had some of those on our tree from my grandparents as well. All right, moving on to our second card. This one uses a more traditional red and green color scheme using our dye inks, but I added a little bit of a vintage twist with some brown ink blending for the background. We're going to use some beautiful crystals on the top of that just for embellishment, and some simple stamping and die cutting with a little bit of an ombre effect. All right, so we're going to start off with our Great Joy stamp set. I'm going to use the die first. This is a solid die, so you'll find it's definitely easier to die cut these first. Then I'm going to show you how to line them up with a stamp positioner to get them perfectly aligned. It's easier when you have a solid die like this, instead of stamping and then trying to line it up. This is just an easier way to do it. At the same time there, I went ahead and die cut a white frame using the Essentials diagonal stitched rectangle, the largest one from that. It's another one of our great basic dies that I use all the time. All right, I'm going to be using a Misty to go ahead and stamp these images on here. I'm going to start off with the negative piece of those die cuts that I cut out of the white cardstock. And I'm going to take that main large wreath image from the Great Joy stamp set, and I'm just going to line it up in that negative space. I cut there because I kind of had to put the top of my head over the top of it to make sure I had it lined up. It's best if you can get a direct up and down view, so I didn't figure you wanted to see the back of my head. But now that I had it perfectly lined up there, I could set my die into that negative space, and now I can stamp over the top. I'm starting off using Grassy Knoll. This is the second darkest in this family of green inks. They all come in coordinating lighter to darker. Then I'm going to leave everything positioned exactly as it is and use key lime, but only ink up the bottom 2/3 of that stamp. And then go ahead and stamp right over the top of that again. And I don't know if you'll be able to see as quickly now, but that kind of leaves a little bit of an ombre effect, kind of a gradient look. And then we're going to come in with the darkest in this color family, which is olive. And I'm only going to stamp that on the bottom third there. I'm going to pull that out and give you a little bit of a closer look, but it ends up with a great variation of color, lightest at the top and darkest on the bottom. And because you're stamping over each part darker, it doesn't matter if you've already stamped a lighter ink. It's easy just to go ahead and stamp the next darkest over the top, and it's going to cover that lighter shade of the green. All right, I did the same thing to line up that bow from the same stamp set, and I cut it again so you didn't have to see the back of my head. For this one, I'm using the Bright Happy Candy Apple Red. I love this. It's a great Christmassy red color, and it was perfect for stamping that bow on. All right, I'm going to move all of my mess out of the way there with the Misty and the inks. And then I'm going to curl up the edges of that wreath a little. You could also stamp this directly onto the wreath in that little negative space you can see there, but using the die cut just adds a little more dimension. I'm going to add just a dot of liquid glue in the middle there and line it up. I'm going to set that aside to let it dry, and then I can curl those edges up a little more for even more of a dimensional look. All right. Now I'm going to do some ink blending on this panel of white cardstock. I'm going to use Doe ink. It's a great, just soft, vintagey brown feeling ink. I'm using some ergonomic blending brushes from Pink and Maine. Use any blending brushes you like. I really like just how soft these are, and I feel like they blend our inks really well. And they're great for big backgrounds like this, easy on your hands, and they're big, so they make quick work of the ink blending on the background. And I'm going nice and soft and just gradually layering the ink over. And you might notice I'm starting off the edge of that cardstock panel and then continuing just over it. That helps keep me from getting any sharp lines or blobs of ink because it gets a little bit of that ink off on my scratch paper. And this is just inexpensive white printer paper. A lot of people like to use a glass media mat or a nonstick mat, and it allows you to keep using the ink that you rub off. I've just found this works really well for me. I did the darkest blending at the top and bottom, and then just a little around the side for kind of a vignette look. So it leaves a little softer white color in the center. All right, now once again, I had to add a few splatters. This time, instead of using gold, I'm going to use some more of our dye ink, just a shade darker. This is Gathered Twigs, and I'm just going to kind of smoosh it a little bit on a clear stamp block. And excuse my dirty water from our last project. I forgot to get clean water in between. And I'm just going to use a paintbrush to mix a little water with that ink, and then I can use that carefully with that little paintbrush just to add a few splatters over the background. I'm trying to hit the top left and bottom right corner the most with a little bit of the splatters in the center as well, but it kind of just gives a little bit of flow and direction to the card as well. You can see those splatters better now that I've pulled it out of my box there. All right, and then you can see the positioning of that wreath now that I've got that background, and those splatters are going to dry super fast with that dye ink. It's just as long as it takes for the water to evaporate, and it's going to set those nice and quickly, which is also another great trick if you're kind of in a hurry and you want to add splatters, but you need them to be dry quickly. I found those dry almost immediately. All right, same thing. I'm trimming down my foam adhesive to fit on the back of that wreath and make sure it goes all the way around and nice and solid. Then I can pull all of those little backings off. It helps if you have fingernails. I know that makes it a little more challenging. So my fingernails always seem to be really short, so it makes it hard to get a hold of those pieces. And then I'm going to carefully line that up over there and press it into place. And you can see that that bow has dried nicely now in the center, so I can pop all those little edges up, and it just adds a tiny little bit of dimension that's super fun. I have that piece that I die cut a little while ago from Essentials Diagonal Stitched Rectangles. I have that panel, which I did trim to make sure it was just small enough to fit inside that frame. So you can see those diagonal stitches around the sides, and it adds a great little bit of texture to that back layer. And it's going to help, having that white layer is going to help that brown panel just to pop off of my red card base. I coordinated my red card base with the bow on the center of the wreath. But before I adhere this down, I want to add my sentiment in the middle because I'm going to use foam adhesive, and that's going to mess up stamping of my sentiment. So about now is when I remembered, oh yeah, I need to add that sentiment in the middle. So I chose one of the sentiments from that stamp set, the same Great Joy. I'm going to stamp it in that same Gathered Twigs that we used for the splatters. It helps keep everything nicely color coordinated. And I just lined it up with my Misty so I could stamp it in the center of that wreath. Now, as you can see, I can add my foam adhesive to that back. That's why I wanted to stamp my sentiment first, because there's some holes in there and I might not have gotten an even stamp on my sentiment if I'd already adhered this onto my card base. All right, peel those off, line that up centered with my red card base, and press that into place. And then finally, we're going to end with some of the red from our crystals mix. These are clear, they have a little bit of a pointed tip on them, and they kind of have a partly flat back, which is what I'm going to adhere down onto my card. Once I get them pressed into place, I'll give you a little bit of a closer look so you can kind of see the shape of these. They're super sparkly and super fun, and the fact that they're completely transparent kind of makes them fun for adhering on your card. I'm using a crystal katana, just a jewel picker to press them into place, and then I like to use glossy accents with a detail tip on it to adhere them in place. You can kind of see how sparkly they are, and can you kind of see those pointed tips a little bit, kind of how they adhere on the card. So super dimensional and nice and fun, and lots of sparkle just to enhance that card as well. All right, that finishes this one off. Lots of layers and dimension. Again, you can simplify some of the dimension if you want to make it easier to pop this card in the mail, but super fun for hand delivering the way it is, and some of the little touches just to make it fun.
All right, thanks so much for joining me and for following along as we created these cards. I hope they inspired you and gave you a little bit of a start for some ideas for your own Christmas card making here soon. Have a great day, and once again, Merry Christmas.